Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be doing another player review. And today it is Tomas Hertl, number 48. And it was a bit of a, I say a bit, but it was actually a very odd season for Tomas Hertl, as there were two big factors that were kind of clashing for him this season. One was his statistical output, which was still just as solid and strong as ever, and yet the other was the eye test, where honestly I felt as though it kind of left a lot to be desired. You take a look at the player who I pointed out as the best Sharks player this season, Evander Kane. Not only were the statistics there to back up what we saw from the eye test, but in that eye test it showed that he was all over the ice, 200-foot player, solid offensive guy, solid defensive guy, and just had a wonderful season. However, with Tomas Hertl this season, I never really felt the same way. Over the 50 games that he actually ended up playing this season, there were very, very few in which he stood out in such a positive light, and so it seems as though he maybe just picked up, an assist or a goal here or there. Let's recall just 2 seasons ago, the 18-19 season, Tomas Hertl career year for himself, managing 76 points during that season. I remember watching Hertl play during that year, and it was like, it was a master class. He was such an amazing elite power forward during that season. He felt like he was sort of like a prime of Evgeny Malkin, just, maybe a step below that, but essentially playing a similar style of game where you couldn't knock him off the puck. He would constantly win battles down low in the offensive zone, in the corners, along the walls. He could consistently force this puck to the net, and more often than not, it would go in. And he was also a force on the penalty kill as well as on the power play that season, and because of all that, he got his 76 points. This season, even though that the stats will back it up, that he had a pretty decent year, 19 goals on the season, and then put over 82 games, that would have been 31 goals. 24 assists over 82 games would be 39 assists, and his 43 points over 82 games would have been 70 points, just a couple behind Evander Kane, and yet it did not nearly feel as dominant as he did a couple of years ago. And as it should be pointed out that some sluggishness could be due to the fact that he ended up missing those 6 games in the middle of the year, which was due to COVID. Apparently he got COVID, and it also spread to his wife and his child, and apparently it was also quite bad. There were a lot of issues with that. However, I can only judge exactly with what I see on the ice, so even if this COVID situation did indeed play a role in the sluggishness that we saw from Tomas Hertl this season, I can't necessarily allow that to affect my grade this season. So all I can really say is that it was Hertl playing some solid hockey, at least statistically, but when you actually watched him play, it wasn't so great. Now that means kind of 2 things here in this situation. The first is that it kind of shows how not so great a year it was for many of the Sharks players, and that Tomas Hertl still managed to be 4th on my list in terms of player ratings, and how players like Logan Couture, Timo Meier, Erik Karlsson, Brent Burns, all of these players still found themselves behind a struggling Tomas Hertl is not really a great sign. And the other thing is that if Tomas Hertl, even in a pretty sluggish season, actually still managed to put up 43 points, which would be 70 points over a full year, can you imagine when he actually does get back to that high level? Yes, we did see that a couple of years ago, and he only managed the 76 points. I mean, I say only, but 76 points, but I feel as though there is still another level, it seems as though, that Tomas Hertl can get to, and we may even see a point per game pace from him if the Sharks and Tomas Hertl can actually find their game here over the next couple of years. Hertl's contract does actually run out rather soon, not next season, but the end of next season, and so we'll see what the Sharks decide to do and what Hertl will actually ask for in terms of money. Moving on to the plus-minus, he was actually a +1 this season. As I've said, like a broken record in the past 3 videos, yes, plus-minus as a stat is not particularly reliable in a single game, but when you spread it over 50 games, it actually ends up sort of evening out to be a half-decent stat, and because the San Jose Sharks were not a very good team, most of the plus-minus stats for all of the players will trend towards the negative direction because your team as a whole is giving up more goals than they are scoring. However, Tomas Hertl ends up being the only relevant Sharks player, and by relevant Sharks player, I mean player who has played like a decent amount of games, to actually be a plus player this season. The other highest was Evander Kane with that -1, but Tomas Hertl actually managed to maintain a positive rating, which is extremely impressive and goes to show that he has really developed this defensive game over the last few years. We already knew he was an effective penalty killing player, but the fact that even when he's getting constant shifts with players like Carlson and Burns, who have struggled defensively this season, and with the fact that the Sharks just as a whole are not playing particularly well defensively, and they have Martin Jones, who's a bit of a sieve back there in net, the fact that he managed to actually still maintain this positive rating was very, very solid for him. And finally, let us talk about his ice time this season. 19 minutes and 8 seconds. That puts him third in terms of forward. Already I mentioned that Evander Kane was first in terms of forward with over 20 minutes. Logan Couture was actually second place in that regard. Not too much of a surprise. Logan Couture plays in all situations similar to Tomas Hertl. The power play, the penalty kill, and at even strength. But maybe, just a few longer shifts here or there. Logan Couture at times was on what you would call, I guess, the first line. And also Logan Couture is the captain. And on top of that, when the Sharks do go down 5-on-3, which didn't happen much this season, but it does happen on occasion, the Sharks do go with Logan Couture over a player like Tomas Hertl in terms of shorthanded. So it's not necessarily surprised that Hertl loses out by just a handful of seconds, but in the end, it does still goes to show that as this second line center, or I guess you could say top 6 center for the San Jose Sharks, considering it's kind of not really set in stone which of these players is a first liner and which of these players is a second liner, it just goes to show that Tomas Hertl still is getting a ton of shifts and is being leaned on a ton by head coach Bob Booner. And one other aspect that could potentially have affected his ice time this season is, of course, that COVID situation. For all we know, that even after returning to the lineup, maybe there were some issues that kept him from playing as much as he did previously. But as we move on to the grade for the year, as I mentioned, he is 4th on this list, and so he is not an A+ player, he is not an A player, he's not an A- player, and I made the executive decision to have Rudolf Balcers at a B+, just barely above Tomas Hertl this season, just because of that eye test situation that I mentioned earlier with Hertl. However, it was still a solid statistical year, still a solid defensive year for Hertl, and so I can't justify giving him any less than a very solid B+. Class dismissed.